The morning sun cast long shadows across the Riverside Community Center as Sarah Mitchell adjusted the collar of her security uniform, carefully ensuring it covered the jagged scars that traced their way up her neck like lightning frozen in flesh. Her weathered hands bore the calluses of someone who had learned to find purpose in simple work, but her eyes held depths that spoke of experiences far beyond the quiet halls she now patrolled. The children's laughter, echoing through the building, brought a rare smile to her face as families arrived for the annual science fair, their excited voices filling spaces that usually knew only silence. Parents juggled project displays while kids bounced with anticipation, none of them paying attention to the scarred woman in the plain gray uniform, who watched over them with protective intensity that went unnoticed by those who saw only surface imperfections. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The security office at Riverside Community Center felt more like a forgotten storage closet than a command post, its cramped space filled with outdated monitors and a desk that had seen better decades. Sarah Mitchell had grown comfortable in this overlooked corner of the building, where she could observe without being observed, protect without being acknowledged, and find peace in the simple routine of keeping others safe. Her morning rounds took her through corridors lined with children's artwork and community announcements, past the gymnasium where seniors practiced Tai Chi, and through the multi-purpose rooms where after-school programs brought life to spaces that might otherwise sit empty. The scarring that covered the left side of her face and neck had long since stopped bothering her personally, but she had learned to navigate the world's discomfort with practiced grace, turning slightly to present her unmarked profile during conversations, wearing clothing that concealed the worst of the damage, and accepting the way people's eyes would dart away when they first encountered her. The annual Children's Science Fair represented the pinnacle of Sarah's year, a day when the community center transformed into a celebration of young minds and family pride. She had spent weeks preparing for the event, reviewing floor plans, coordinating with vendors, and ensuring that every detail would contribute to a safe and memorable experience for the 200 families expected to attend. Her background checks on volunteers had been thorough, her inspection of electrical systems meticulous, and her emergency protocols comprehensive in ways that impressed her supervisor without him quite understanding why a simple security guard would possess such institutional knowledge. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah that her most valuable skills remained invisible to those who benefited from them most. But she had made peace with anonymity years ago when she traded her uniform for civilian clothes and her military bearing for the quiet deference expected of someone in her position. Detective Mike Rodriguez arrived at the community center just after 9 in the morning, his presence immediately shifting the atmosphere from festive to tense as word spread that police were asking questions about someone who might be attending the science fair. Sarah observed his interactions with families from her position near the main entrance, noting the professional courtesy that masked underlying urgency and the way his eyes systematically cataloged faces, exits, and potential threats with the trained awareness of someone expecting trouble. Rodriguez's conversation with the event coordinator revealed fragments of information that painted a disturbing picture. Tyler Brooks, a former military contractor with documented psychological issues and a restraining order violation, had made threats against his ex-wife and daughter, both of whom were scheduled to attend today's science fair with a project about renewable energy that had earned recognition in preliminary judging. The detective's briefing to Sarah was perfunctory, treating her as another civilian employee who needed basic awareness rather than someone capable of contributing meaningful insight to a developing security situation. We have reason to believe that Tyler Brooks might attempt to approach his family during today's event, Rodriguez explained, his tone carrying the patient condescension reserved for those he assumed lacked relevant experience. He's violated a restraining order twice. in the past month, and we want to be proactive about preventing any confrontation that might disrupt the children's activities." Sarah nodded with appropriate concern while mentally cataloging the tactical challenges presented by the community center's layout, the multiple entry points that would be impossible to monitor with current staffing, and the hundreds of innocent civilians who would be trapped if Brooks decided to escalate beyond simple harassment. What Detective Rodriguez couldn't see beneath Sarah's deferential exterior was a mind that had spent 3 tours of duty learning to assess threats, neutralize dangers, and protect those who couldn't protect themselves in environments far more complex than a suburban community center. Her scars told the story of an IED explosion that had ended her military career, but they couldn't convey the expertise she had gained in urban warfare, precision shooting, and crisis management under conditions that would have overwhelmed most law enforcement officers. The tattoo that remained hidden beneath her uniform sleeve bore the insignia of the 82nd Airborne Division Sniper Unit, a mark of achievement that represented capabilities far beyond what anyone in this building would imagine possible from someone they saw only as damaged goods relegated to minimum wage security work. The morning proceeded with deceptive normalcy as families continued arriving for the science fair, their children's excitement building as display tables, filled with projects ranging from volcano models to solar-powered vehicles. Sarah maintained her regular patrol pattern while staying in radio contact with Detective Rodriguez, who had positioned himself near the main entrance with backup officers stationed at secondary exits. The festive atmosphere made threat assessment challenging, as every adult male generated momentary concern before being dismissed. Every raised voice triggered brief alarm before being recognized as parental enthusiasm, and every unexpected movement required evaluation in a context where unexpected movements were constant and generally harmless. At 10:47 a.m., Sarah's radio crackled with Rodriguez's voice carrying new urgency. "All units, Tyler Brooks has been spotted in the parking structure across from the community center. He appears to be observing the building through binoculars and may be armed. Maintain current positions, but be prepared for immediate lockdown procedures." The transformation in Sarah's demeanor was subtle but complete as years of military training automatically engaged, her posture straightening slightly, her breathing becoming more controlled, and her awareness expanding to encompass not just the immediate environment, but potential fields of fire, cover positions, and escape routes that most people would never consider. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on her. The very people who dismissed her because of her scars were about to depend on skills those scars represented for their safety and survival. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Officer Jake Henderson arrived as backup just as the situation began escalating, his youth and inexperience evident in the way he checked and rechecked his equipment, while casting nervous glances toward the parking structure where Brooks had been sighted. Sarah watched him struggle with basic crowd control concepts that should have been second nature, noting his tendency to position himself where he blocked rather than facilitated evacuation routes, and recognizing the dangerous combination of adrenaline and inexperience that could turn a manageable situation into a catastrophe. When Henderson attempted to establish radio contact with command, his nervousness transmitted itself to nearby families who began asking questions about the police presence, creating exactly the kind of attention that professional security protocols were designed to avoid. The first sign of serious trouble came when Dr. Emily Chun, the crisis negotiator who had been called to assist with potential communication, reported that Brooks had abandoned his observation position and was no longer visible in the parking structure. This could indicate either withdrawal or advancement toward the target location. She announced over radio frequencies that Sarah monitored through her security equipment. All personnel should assume that subject is mobile and potentially approaching the community center through unknown routes. The clinical language couldn't disguise the reality that 200 families with young children were now potential targets for someone whose military training made him far more dangerous than the average domestic violence perpetrator. Sarah's request to participate in tactical planning was met with the kind of polite dismissal she had grown accustomed to receiving from law enforcement officers who saw only her civilian clothes and facial scarring. "Ma'am, we appreciate your concern, but this is a police matter that requires specialized training," Detective Rodriguez explained when she approached with observations about the building's vulnerabilities. "The best thing you can do is help keep the families calm while we handle the security aspects of this situation." His tone carried the unconscious arrogance of someone who assumed that relevant expertise was immediately visible and that anyone lacking obvious credentials must therefore lack useful knowledge. The community center's public address system crackled to life just after 11 o'clock with an announcement that would transform the morning's celebration into everyone's worst nightmare. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Tyler Brooks. I know you're all here enjoying your children's little science projects, but we're going to play a different kind of game today." The voice carried calm authority that was somehow more terrifying than shouting would have been, suggesting someone in complete control of both himself and the situation he was creating. "Nobody needs to get hurt if everyone follows instructions exactly as I give them. All exits are now blocked, all communication with the outside world has been cut, and anyone who tries to be a hero will discover why that's a very bad idea." Chaos erupted throughout the community center as families realized they were trapped in an active hostage situation with their children. But it was controlled chaos that revealed Brooks possessed the tactical knowledge to orchestrate fear without losing command of his operation. The exits that families rushed toward were indeed blocked, not by Brooks himself, but by explosive devices that had been placed with the precision of someone who understood both the building's layout and human psychology. Parents pulled children close while scanning for escape routes that no longer existed. Teachers tried to maintain calm among students who sensed adult terror without understanding its source, and elderly volunteers found themselves responsible for maintaining order in a situation that challenged every assumption about community safety. Detective Rodriguez's attempts to establish communication with Brooks revealed the depth of their tactical disadvantage. The perpetrator had somehow gained access to the building's security systems, could monitor police radio frequencies, and demonstrated knowledge of law enforcement protocols that suggested military or security training far beyond what his file indicated. "Your response time was exactly what I expected," Brooks announced over the intercom system, his voice carrying amusement rather than stress. "Your positioning is textbook, your backup requests follow standard patterns, and your negotiation attempts are so predictable that I could have written the script myself. We're going to try something different today." The demands that Brooks presented were designed to create maximum psychological pressure while demonstrating his complete control over the situation. He wanted his ex-wife and daughter brought to the main auditorium within 30 minutes, demanded that all police officers withdraw to positions at least 500 meters from the building, and insisted that news media be prevented from approaching the scene until he chose to contact them directly. "If any of these conditions are not met exactly as specified, I will begin demonstrating the capabilities of the devices I've placed throughout this building," he announced with clinical precision. "The children's safety depends entirely on your ability to follow simple instructions without the cowboy heroics that seem to be standard procedure for your department." Outside the building, command vehicles arrived as senior officials recognized that the situation exceeded normal protocols for domestic violence calls. Captain Lisa Thompson took charge of the scene with the grim efficiency of someone who understood that Brooks's military background and tactical preparation had created a scenario with very limited options for successful resolution. The explosive devices blocking exits appeared to be real based on preliminary assessment, The hostage count included over 60 children under the age of 12, and the perpetrators' demonstrated knowledge of police procedures suggested that conventional approaches would likely result in casualties that no one was prepared to accept. Sarah Mitchell watched the official response develop with growing frustration as she recognized tactical errors that could prove fatal for the families. Trapped inside the community center, the police positioning revealed their planned approach routes to anyone monitoring from inside the building. Their radio communications were apparently compromised based on Brooks's comments, and their assumption that overwhelming force would eventually provide solutions ignored the reality that explosives could turn any assault into a massacre. Her attempts to share observations about the building's layout and Brooks's likely positioning were dismissed by officers who saw only a scared civilian employee rather than someone whose expertise might prove relevant to their tactical challenges. The breakthrough moment came when Sergeant David Park arrived as part of the specialized response team, his experienced eyes immediately noticing details that others had missed about both the tactical situation and the people involved in trying to resolve it. Park's background included multiple deployments with special operations units, experience in urban warfare that paralleled Brooks's training, and most importantly, the ability to recognize expertise regardless of where it was found. His conversation with Sarah began as routine information gathering, but quickly evolved into something else entirely as he realized that her knowledge of the building, understanding of tactical principles, and calm demeanor under pressure suggested capabilities that exceeded those of most law enforcement officers. "You seem to understand this situation better than most people would," Park observed as Sarah pointed out vulnerabilities in the current police positioning that could be exploited by someone with Brooks's apparent skill level. "Your assessment of his likely tactics and the building's defensive characteristics sounds like it comes from personal experience rather than general observation." Sarah's response was careful, measured by years of learning to conceal her background, while still trying to contribute meaningfully to situations where her expertise could save lives. "I've spent a lot of time in this building, and I've seen enough conflict to recognize when someone knows what they're doing." Park's follow-up questions revealed a professional curiosity that went beyond routine information gathering, and Sarah found herself describing tactical considerations that she shouldn't have understood unless she possessed military training that significantly exceeded basic service. Her analysis of Brooks's psychological profile, assessment of his probable objectives, and understanding of the explosive device's likely placement and triggering mechanisms demonstrated knowledge that couldn't be explained by civilian security experience. When she unconsciously adjusted her sleeve during their conversation, Park caught a glimpse of dark ink that made him look more carefully at the woman whose insights had been impressing him with their sophistication and accuracy. The moment of recognition came when Sarah turned to point out a potential approach route, causing her sleeve to shift enough to reveal the distinctive eagle and sniper crosshairs that marked her as a member of one of the military's most elite units. Park's reaction was immediate and transformative as he realized that the scarred security guard he had been talking with possessed credentials that exceeded those of anyone else involved in the current crisis response. 82nd Airborne, sniper. "Qualified," he said quietly, his tone carrying the respect that one professional warrior accorded another. "How many confirmed kills? How many tours? And what the hell are you doing working security at a community center?" Sarah's decision to reveal her background represented a calculated risk that years of civilian life had taught her to avoid. But the desperate situation demanded that she set aside personal protection for the sake of others who couldn't protect themselves. 3 tours, 47 confirmed kills, and a medical discharge after an IED took out most of my team, she replied with the matter-of-fact tone that veterans used when discussing experiences that civilians couldn't comprehend. "I'm working security here because it's quiet, it's safe, And it lets me help people without having to explain why someone who looks like me might actually know what she's talking about. The conversation that followed transformed not just Park's understanding of Sarah's capabilities, but the entire approach to resolving the hostage crisis as word spread through the command structure that they had an asset inside the building whose expertise might provide options that conventional law enforcement couldn't access. Captain Thompson's initial skepticism gave way to professional interest as Park explained Sarah's qualifications and her intimate knowledge of both the building's layout and Brooks's likely tactical planning. "You're telling me that our security guard is a combat veteran with sniper training who's been inside the target building throughout this entire situation?" Thompson asked, her command experience recognizing the tactical advantages that such positioning could provide. Sarah's assessment of the situation was both comprehensive and sobering as she briefed the command team on details that changed their understanding of what they were facing. Brooks had positioned himself in the main auditorium, where he could observe all entrances while maintaining control over the largest concentration of hostages. His explosive devices were sophisticated enough to suggest military demolitions training, and his psychological profile indicated someone operating under a carefully planned timeline rather than emotional impulse. "He's not just angry," Sarah explained to officers who had been treating this as an escalated domestic dispute. "He's executing a mission with specific objectives, backup plans, and exit strategies. You're not dealing with a desperate ex-husband. You're facing a trained soldier who's decided that he has nothing left to lose." The tactical plan that emerged from Sarah's intelligence represented a complete departure from standard hostage resolution protocols, relying on her unique combination of building knowledge, combat experience, and current positioning to create opportunities that conventional assault teams couldn't access. Her proposal was elegant in its simplicity. Use the building's maintenance systems to create diversions that would allow precise intervention rather than overwhelming force. Exploit Brooks's assumptions about police capabilities to position assets where he wouldn't expect them, and neutralize the threat with surgical precision that would minimize risk to the hostages, while ensuring that Brooks couldn't trigger his explosive devices. Captain Thompson's authorization for Sarah to participate actively in the tactical response represented a leap of faith that challenged every protocol in the department's manual. But the unique circumstances demanded solutions that existed outside normal procedures. "Officially, you're still the building's security guard, providing assistance to law enforcement," Thompson explained as she provided Sarah with communication equipment that would integrate her into the tactical team's coordination network. "Unofficially, you're the best qualified person we have for ending this situation safely, and everyone involved understands that we're depending on your expertise to bring these families home alive." The preparation phase revealed just how thoroughly Sarah's military training had been adapted to civilian life as she transformed from mild-mannered security guard into special operations professional with efficiency that impressed even experienced tactical officers. Her knowledge of the building's mechanical systems provided access routes that hadn't appeared on any official blueprint. Her understanding of Brooks's likely mindset suggested approaches that could exploit his assumptions and expectations, and her calm confidence under pressure reassured both hostages and tactical team members that someone with relevant expertise was finally taking charge of a situation that had exceeded everyone else's capabilities. As Sarah prepared to enter the most dangerous phase of an operation that would determine whether dozens of children went home safely to their families, she reflected on the strange trajectory that had brought her from military sniper to community center security guard to tactical asset in a hostage rescue. The scars that had defined her civilian identity suddenly felt less like marks of damage and more like badges of experience that had prepared her for exactly this moment. The expertise that she had been forced to hide for years was finally being recognized and utilized for its intended purpose, protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. The final phase of preparation included a moment of personal reckoning as Sarah acknowledged that her careful civilian anonymity was about to be shattered forever, but that the lives of innocent children made such considerations irrelevant. Her military training had taught her that some situations demanded personal sacrifice for the greater good, and she had never encountered a situation where that principle applied more clearly than it did today. The laughter that had once greeted her scarred appearance would soon be replaced by the respect accorded to someone whose visible wounds represented invisible capabilities that could mean the difference between tragedy and triumph. The Children's Science Fair had drawn families from across Phoenix's diverse neighborhoods, creating a vibrant tapestry of languages, cultures, and economic backgrounds that reflected the community center's role as a genuine gathering place for people who might never interact otherwise. Sarah noticed how naturally the kids gravitated toward each other's projects, regardless of their parents' social standings. How a girl from the affluent Ahwatukee district could become instant friends with a boy from the struggling Maryvale area over a shared fascination with robotics. The parents were more cautious in their interactions, maintaining polite distance while their children built bridges that adults seemed incapable of constructing. But even the grown-ups couldn't resist smiling when they watched their kids explaining complex scientific concepts with the infectious enthusiasm that only children could generate. Detective Rodriguez's interaction with Sarah epitomized the casual dismissal that had become so familiar she barely registered it anymore. When she approached him with observations about the building's security vulnerabilities, his response carried the particular tone that educated professionals used when addressing service workers who had overstepped their perceived boundaries. "I appreciate your concern about safety," he said while barely glancing up from his notes, "but we have protocols for handling these situations that have been developed by people with extensive training in law enforcement procedures." His gesture toward her security badge suggested that he viewed her position as primarily ceremonial, suitable for checking doors and monitoring lost children, but irrelevant to serious police work that required actual expertise. The condescension extended beyond Rodriguez to encompass the entire law enforcement response as officers arrived to supplement security for the event. Officer Henderson's questions about the building layout were directed to the event coordinator rather than Sarah, despite her obvious familiarity with every corridor, exit, and potential hiding place that 5 years of daily patrols had provided. When she offered insights about traffic patterns and crowd control based on previous large events, her suggestions were acknowledged with the kind of polite nods reserved for well-meaning civilians who didn't understand that real security required professional training rather than casual observation. The psychological weight of such treatment had accumulated over years, until Sarah had learned to anticipate and deflect the assumptions that her appearance generated. The scars that traced across her left cheek and down her neck told a story that most people preferred not to read, creating discomfort that manifested as either excessive sympathy or deliberate avoidance. Parents at the science fair demonstrated both responses, some offering the pitying smiles reserved for those they viewed as damaged, others deliberately positioning themselves to avoid direct eye contact with injuries that reminded them of vulnerabilities they preferred not to acknowledge. Sarah had mastered the art of making herself invisible during such interactions, presenting her unmarked profile and speaking softly to minimize the attention that her presence might otherwise attract. The morning's crowd dynamics revealed patterns that Sarah's military training had taught her to recognize, but that civilian security protocols rarely addressed. Families naturally clustered around popular exhibits, creating bottlenecks that would become dangerous in emergency evacuation scenarios. Parents became absorbed in their children's presentations to the point where they lost awareness of their surroundings, creating opportunities for threats to approach undetected. The excitement that made the event successful also generated noise levels that would mask sounds of forced entry or suspicious activity. while the constant movement of people made it difficult to identify individuals who didn't belong in the space. Dr. Emily Chun's arrival at the community center introduced another layer of professional hierarchy that reinforced Sarah's position at the bottom of any tactical decision-making structure. The crisis negotiator's credentials commanded immediate respect from law enforcement personnel who deferred to her expertise in ways they would never consider doing for a security guard, regardless of that guard's actual qualifications or relevant experience. Chun's assessment of the threat posed by Tyler Brooks relied on psychological profiles and behavioral analysis that seemed sophisticated, but ignored tactical realities that Sarah's combat experience would have immediately identified as critical factors in predicting his likely actions. The disconnect between official expertise and practical knowledge became increasingly apparent as Sarah listened to discussions about Brooks's capabilities and likely behavior. The case file portrayed him as a troubled veteran whose domestic violence history made him dangerous primarily to his immediate family, with psychological evaluations suggesting that his military experience was limited to logistic support rather than combat operations. Sarah's trained eye recognized details in the intelligence reports that suggested a much more capable adversary than the officials realized, but her attempts to share these observations were dismissed as speculation from someone who lacked the professional qualifications to interpret such information accurately. The community center's layout presented tactical challenges that Sarah understood instinctively, but that the responding officers seemed to overlook in their focus on standard crowd control procedures. The building's original design as a warehouse had been modified over decades to create multiple smaller spaces, connected by corridors that would channel movement in predictable patterns during any emergency. The main auditorium's elevated stage provided observation advantages for anyone seeking to monitor multiple entrances simultaneously, while the kitchen facilities offered concealment and access to potential weapons that security protocols hadn't adequately addressed. Officer Henderson's nervous energy became increasingly disruptive as he struggled with crowd management concepts that should have been fundamental to his training. His tendency to position himself where he blocked rather than facilitated movement created exactly the kind of attention that professional security sought to avoid, drawing curious questions from parents who began to sense that police presence indicated something beyond routine precautionary measures. Sarah watched him fumble with basic radio procedures, while casting anxious glances toward the parking structure where Brooks had been spotted, his obvious tension transmitting itself to families who had come expecting celebration rather than potential danger. The first indication that the morning's festivities might be interrupted came when Detective Rodriguez received updated intelligence about Brooks's movements and psychological state. The restraining order violation that had triggered police involvement was apparently more serious than initial reports had suggested, with evidence that Brooks had been conducting surveillance of his ex-wife's activities for several weeks while escalating his threatening behavior beyond verbal harassment. His military record, upon closer examination, revealed specialized training that made him significantly more dangerous than domestic violence protocols typically anticipated. But this information reached the scene too late to fundamentally alter security preparations that had been based on incomplete threat assessment. Sarah's frustration with the official response grew as she recognized missed opportunities to implement security measures that could have prevented the crisis that was beginning to develop. The building's multiple entrances should have been secured from the beginning of the event rather than simply monitored. Visitor screening should have included identification checks that might have detected Brooks's presence and communication. Protocol should have established secure channels that couldn't be monitored by someone with military communications training. These weren't sophisticated concepts that required advanced tactical knowledge, but they represented preventive thinking that civilian law enforcement often overlooked until emergencies forced reactive responses. The transformation in atmosphere. became palpable as word spread among police personnel that the situation was escalating beyond routine domestic violence intervention. Radio chatter increased in frequency and urgency while officers began repositioning themselves in response to intelligence updates that painted Brooks as a more sophisticated threat than anyone had initially realized. The families attending the science fair remained largely unaware of these developments. Their attention focused on children's projects and social interactions. But Sarah noticed subtle changes in adult behavior that suggested growing awareness that something unusual was happening around them. The arrival of additional police units transformed the community center's parking lot into an improvised command post as senior officials recognized that Brooks's military background and demonstrated tactical awareness required resources beyond those typically allocated to domestic disputes. Captain Thompson's presence indicated that the department was treating this as a potential major incident rather than routine family conflict. But her briefing to assembled officers revealed gaps in intelligence and preparation that Sarah found deeply troubling. The assumption that overwhelming police presence would deter Brooks ignored psychological profiles, suggesting someone who viewed confrontation as opportunity rather than obstacle. The community center staff began receiving instructions to maintain normal operations while remaining alert for anything unusual, guidance that reflected law enforcement's desire to avoid panic while preparing for potential emergency action. Sarah's position as security coordinator placed her at the intersection of official police operations and civilian facility management, giving her access to information from both perspectives while highlighting the disconnect between what different groups understood about the developing threat. Her military experience suggested that Brooks's tactical preparation likely exceeded what civilian law enforcement was prepared to counter, but her warnings were treated as speculation rather than professional assessment. The irony of her situation wasn't lost on Sarah as she watched highly trained police officers struggle with concepts that had been second nature to her during military service. The tactical positioning that they viewed as sophisticated appeared elementary when evaluated against standards she had learned in combat zones. Their communication security protocols contained vulnerabilities that any competent adversary could exploit, and their assumption that Brooks would behave predictably ignored psychological factors that combat experience would have immediately recognized as critical variables. Her attempts to share insights were politely deflected by professionals who couldn't imagine that relevant expertise might be found in someone whose appearance suggested vulnerability rather than capability. The morning's events had created a false sense of security among families who interpreted increased police presence as evidence of thorough protection rather than indication of escalating threat. Children continued presenting their science projects with undiminished enthusiasm, while parents socialized and photographed memorable moments. Their civilian mindset unable to process warning signs that Sarah's training made impossible to ignore. The disconnect between perception and reality created exactly the kind of tactical advantage that someone like Brooks would recognize and exploit, using the crowd's complacency as cover for positioning and preparation that might otherwise attract attention. The failure to adequately secure the building's perimeter became apparent when Brooks managed to infiltrate the community center's security systems without detection, demonstrating capabilities that civilian protocols hadn't anticipated and that law enforcement hadn't prepared to counter. His ability to monitor police radio frequencies suggested access to equipment and knowledge that elevated him from domestic violence perpetrator to sophisticated adversary capable of conducting complex operations against trained opposition. The realization that they were dealing with someone whose capabilities exceeded their initial assessment sent shockwaves through the command structure that had been operating under assumptions that were proving dangerously incorrect. Sarah's position as security guard provided unique access to information about Brooks's methods while simultaneously ensuring that her observations would be dismissed by officials. who couldn't reconcile her humble position with the expertise required to understand what was actually happening. Her analysis of how Brooks had gained access to the building, compromised communication systems, and positioned himself for maximum tactical advantage represented insights that could have transformed the official response. But her lack of official credentials meant that such knowledge would remain unutilized until crisis forced recognition of capabilities that had been hiding in plain sight. The children's laughter that had characterized the morning's atmosphere began giving way to adult tension as parents started noticing police activity that seemed disproportionate to any routine security measures. The natural paranoia that accompanied large gatherings in contemporary society made families increasingly aware of law enforcement presence that had initially seemed reassuring but now suggested threats that organizers hadn't disclosed. Sarah watched parental behavior shift from celebration to vigilance as adults began unconsciously positioning themselves between their children and potential danger, their protective instincts activated by environmental cues that they couldn't quite identify but couldn't ignore. The tactical disadvantage created by inadequate threat assessment became critically apparent when Brooks's voice suddenly filled the community center through the public address system, transforming a festive family event into everyone's worst nightmare with words that demonstrated complete control over both the physical environment and the psychological dynamics of everyone trapped inside. His calm delivery was more terrifying than shouting would have been, suggesting someone who had planned this moment carefully and was executing a mission rather than acting from emotional desperation. The immediate chaos that erupted among families revealed just how unprepared civilian populations were for the kind of sophisticated threat that Brooks represented. The revelation that all exits had been blocked with explosive devices demonstrated tactical sophistication that exceeded what domestic violence protocols had anticipated, while Brooks's knowledge of police response procedures suggested military training that went far beyond the logistic support role that his official record indicated. Sarah's assessment of the situation was both comprehensive and terrifying as she realized that the families trapped in the building were facing someone whose capabilities matched or exceeded those of the law enforcement officers supposedly protecting them. The community center had become a battlefield where civilian rules no longer applied, and where survival would depend on expertise that existed outside normal social hierarchies. Detective Rodriguez's attempts to establish communication with Brooks revealed the depth of their tactical disadvantage as the perpetrator demonstrated knowledge of law enforcement protocols that allowed him to anticipate and counter every conventional approach to hostage negotiation. His demands were calculated to create maximum psychological pressure while establishing his complete control over the situation. Designed by someone who understood both the tactical and psychological aspects of hostage scenarios far better than his opponents realized. The 30-minute deadline he established for compliance with his demands represented a timeline that would force hasty decisions while preventing the kind of careful planning that successful resolution typically required. The police response that had seemed adequate for managing domestic violence suddenly appeared woefully insufficient for countering someone whose military training and tactical preparation had created a scenario with very limited options for successful resolution. Captain Thompson's grim assessment of their situation acknowledged realities that had been developing throughout the morning, but that official protocols hadn't prepared them to address. The explosive devices blocking exits eliminated conventional assault options. The large number of child hostages made any aggressive action extremely risky, and Brooks's demonstrated knowledge of police procedures suggested that standard approaches would likely result in casualties that no one was prepared to accept. The command structure that had been confident in its ability to manage the situation just hours earlier now found itself facing tactical challenges that exceeded their training and experience, while the person with the most relevant expertise remained dismissed as a civilian employee whose observations were treated as helpful but ultimately irrelevant to professional decision-making. Sarah's frustration with this dynamic was tempered by her understanding that revealing her background would fundamentally alter her ability to operate undetected within the building. But the stakes were rising to levels where personal considerations might have to be sacrificed for the greater good of protecting innocent lives that hung in the balance. The sophistication of Brooks's operation became terrifyingly clear as reports flooded in from officers attempting to establish perimeter security around the community center. Every conventional approach to tactical positioning had been anticipated and countered with devices that demonstrated knowledge of both explosives and police procedures that went far beyond what any domestic violence case file had suggested. The explosive charges weren't crude pipe bombs or improvised devices, but professionally constructed demolitions that had been precisely placed to channel any rescue attempt through predetermined kill zones where Brooks would hold every advantage. Each device was equipped with multiple triggering mechanisms that made disarmament extremely dangerous, while their positioning ensured that any attempt to breach the building would likely result in catastrophic casualties among the hostages. Captain Thompson's assessment of their tactical options grew increasingly grim as specialists arrived to evaluate the explosive devices and confirmed what Sarah had already suspected from her observation of Brooks's methodical approach to the operation. The devices were military-grade charges that had been positioned by someone with extensive knowledge of both demolitions and urban warfare tactics, creating overlapping fields of destruction that would make any conventional assault suicidal for both attackers and hostages. The timer mechanisms were sophisticated enough to suggest professional training, while the redundant triggering systems indicated someone who had planned for every contingency that law enforcement might attempt. Inside the community center, Brooks's psychological manipulation of the hostages revealed tactical awareness that extended beyond mere technical competence into understanding of human behavior under extreme stress. His instructions to families were delivered with calm authority that made resistance seem both futile and potentially fatal, while his positioning in the main auditorium allowed him to observe and control the largest concentration of people while maintaining command over all access routes. The parents who had been celebrating their children's achievements just minutes earlier now found themselves following orders from someone whose military bearing and obvious competence made defiance seem like a guaranteed path to disaster. The hostage population presented unique challenges that complicated any potential rescue operation beyond what standard protocols had been designed to address. 63 children between the ages of 5 and 14 were scattered throughout the auditorium, their natural tendency to seek comfort from parents, creating clusters that would be impossible to evacuate quickly in case of emergency action. The adults, numbering 47 including teachers and volunteers, were paralyzed by protective instincts that made them prioritize their children's safety over any consideration of resistance or escape. The elderly volunteers who had been helping with the science fair became particular concerns, their limited mobility and health issues creating additional variables that any rescue plan would have to accommodate. Brooks's demands revealed strategic thinking that went beyond simple revenge against his ex-wife and daughter, encompassing objectives that suggested broader grievances against institutions and individuals who had failed to recognize his capabilities or address his needs. His requirement that all police withdraw to positions more than 500 meters from the building demonstrated understanding of law enforcement tactics, while creating conditions that would force authorities to rely on negotiation rather than direct action. The prohibition against media contact until he chose to communicate suggested someone who understood the psychological dynamics of hostage situations and intended to control information flow to maximize his leverage over both officials and public opinion. The 30-minute timeline that Brooks had established for compliance with his demands created artificial urgency that forced decision-making under conditions where careful planning was impossible. a tactic that Sarah recognized from urban warfare. Scenarios where time pressure was used to force opponents into tactical errors. The deadline wasn't arbitrary but calculated to prevent law enforcement from developing effective countermeasures, while ensuring that any attempted rescue would have to proceed under conditions that favored the defender rather than attackers. Brooks's military training was evident in every aspect of the operation, from his understanding of police response times to his exploitation of civilian psychology to his positioning for maximum tactical advantage. The communication intercepts that revealed Brooks's ability to monitor police radio frequencies demonstrated technical capabilities that elevated him from desperate ex-husband to sophisticated adversary capable of conducting electronic warfare against trained opposition. His knowledge of law enforcement communication protocols allowed him to anticipate and counter every conventional approach to tactical coordination, while his access to the building's security systems provided real-time intelligence about police positioning and movement that made surprise virtually impossible. The technological advantage he held over responding officers represented a force multiplier that transformed the tactical equation in ways that conventional hostage resolution training had never addressed. Dr. Chun's psychological profile of Brooks underwent rapid revision as evidence accumulated that he possessed capabilities far beyond what domestic violence protocols had anticipated. But her assessment still focused on emotional motivations rather than tactical realities that would determine whether the hostages survived the next few hours. Her recommendation for patient negotiation based on addressing his underlying grievances ignored the possibility that Brooks had no intention of releasing hostages regardless of whether his demands were met, that his operation might be designed to end in violence rather than resolution, and that his military training gave him both the capability and mindset to execute casualties if his timeline wasn't respected. The failure of conventional law enforcement approaches became apparent as specialists attempted to gather intelligence about Brooks's positioning and capabilities through methods that he had obviously anticipated and prepared to counter. Thermal imaging revealed multiple heat signatures that suggested decoy positioning designed to confuse targeting. Electronic surveillance detected jamming equipment that prevented accurate assessment of his location and activities, and attempts to establish visual contact through building windows encountered prepared concealment that blocked observation while allowing Brooks to monitor police movement. Every technical advantage that authorities assumed they possessed was being neutralized by someone whose preparation had accounted for capabilities he knew they would deploy. Sarah's analysis of Brooks's tactical approach revealed patterns that her combat experience made impossible to ignore, but that civilian law enforcement seemed unable to recognize despite mounting evidence that they were facing an adversary whose capabilities exceeded their own. His positioning, timing, preparation, and execution all indicated someone operating under military discipline rather than emotional desperation, suggesting that this wasn't a domestic violence incident that had escalated beyond control, but a carefully planned operation designed to achieve objectives that went beyond simply hurting his ex-wife. The implications of this assessment were both terrifying and potentially actionable, but Sarah's civilian status ensured that her insights would be dismissed until events forced recognition of realities that officials preferred not to acknowledge. The deteriorating situation inside the community center became evident through communications intercepts that revealed growing panic among hostages as they began to understand that their situation was far more dangerous than anyone had initially realized. Brooks's calm competence was more frightening than ranting would have been, suggesting someone in complete control of both himself and the tactical environment he had created. Parents were struggling to keep children calm while processing their own terror. Teachers were attempting to maintain some semblance of order among students who sensed adult fear without understanding its source, and elderly volunteers were becoming increasingly distressed as their physical limitations made them feel helpless in a situation that challenged everyone's ability to cope. The explosive devices that blocked all conventional exit routes represented technical challenges that bomb disposal experts estimated would require hours to safely disarm, assuming they could gain access to the devices without triggering secondary charges that Brooks had almost certainly installed as countermeasures. The sophistication of the demolitions suggested someone with military explosives training that went far beyond basic ordnance handling, while the positioning and interconnected triggering systems indicated tactical engineering that had been designed to defeat exactly the kind of professional response that was being mounted against them. Every minute that passed without action increased the likelihood that Brooks would begin implementing whatever final phase his operation was designed to achieve. The command structure that had been confident in its ability to manage the situation found itself facing tactical realities that exceeded their training, experience, and available resources, while the clock continued counting down toward a deadline that represented either compliance with impossible demands or the beginning of casualties that could exceed anything in the department's history. Captain Thompson's conversations with federal authorities revealed bureaucratic processes that would take hours to authorize resources that might be needed within minutes, while her assessment of local capabilities suggested that conventional approaches were not just inadequate, but potentially counterproductive when deployed against someone with Brooks's evident expertise. The psychological pressure being exerted on decision-makers was exactly what Brooks had intended to achieve, forcing authorities to choose between unacceptable options, while operating under time constraints that prevented careful planning or coordination with specialized resources that might eventually provide solutions. His understanding of institutional limitations and bureaucratic processes was evident in demands calculated to exceed what local authorities could deliver while preventing escalation to federal agencies, whose capabilities might pose genuine threats to his operation. The tactical sophistication of his approach suggested military planning that had anticipated every conventional response and prepared countermeasures that would neutralize advantages that law enforcement assumed they possessed. The families trapped inside the community center were beginning to understand that their safety depended on factors beyond anything they could control or influence, that their lives hung in the balance of decisions being made by people whose capabilities might prove insufficient for the challenges they faced. The children's science projects that had represented hope and achievement just hours earlier now seemed like symbols of innocence that was being systematically destroyed by someone whose grievances extended beyond personal revenge to encompass broader anger at institutions and individuals who had failed to recognize his worth or address his needs. Sarah's position as an overlooked security guard provided unique access to information about the developing crisis while ensuring that her assessment of Brooks's capabilities and likely intentions would remain unutilized by officials who couldn't imagine that relevant expertise might be found in someone whose appearance suggested damage rather than competence. Her frustration with this dynamic was tempered by understanding that revealing her background would fundamentally alter her ability to operate within the building. But the stakes were rising to levels where personal considerations might have to be sacrificed for the greater good of protecting lives that conventional approaches seemed increasingly unlikely to save. The moment when Sarah made her decision to step forward represented both personal risk and tactical opportunity, as her unique combination of military expertise, building knowledge, and current positioning provided capabilities that no one else involved in the crisis possessed. Her approach to Sergeant Park was calculated to test whether military professionals might be more receptive to unconventional solutions than civilian law enforcement had proven to be, while her careful revelation of technical knowledge served to demonstrate competence without immediately exposing the full extent of her background and capabilities. The conversation that followed would determine whether Sarah's expertise could be utilized to save lives or whether institutional prejudices would continue to prevent recognition of capabilities that could transform the tactical equation in ways That might provide hope for families whose survival depended on decisions being made by people who had been dismissing the most qualified person available to help them. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on her as she prepared to risk everything she had built in civilian life for the chance to utilize skills that represented her truest identity and highest calling. The explosive revelation that would follow represented more than simple credential verification, but the fundamental transformation of how everyone involved understood both the threat they faced and the resources available to counter it. Brooks's sophisticated operation had been designed to defeat conventional law enforcement capabilities, but his planning hadn't anticipated the possibility that his opponents might include someone whose expertise exceeded his own and whose positioning provided advantages that couldn't be neutralized through technological countermeasures or tactical preparation. The stakes couldn't have been higher as Sarah prepared to emerge from the anonymity that had protected her for years, knowing that the next few minutes would determine not just whether she could contribute to resolving the crisis, but whether dozens of innocent lives would be lost to violence that her expertise might be able to prevent. The community center that had been her quiet refuge from the complexities of her past was about to become the arena where those complexities would be revealed in service of protecting others who faced threats they couldn't comprehend or counter. Without help from someone whose capabilities had been hiding in plain sight, the transformation that was about to occur would challenge every assumption that had shaped the crisis response, revealing that the most qualified person to counter Brooks's sophisticated operation had been present from the beginning but dismissed by officials who couldn't recognize expertise that didn't conform to their expectations of how knowledge and capability should be packaged. The laughter that had once greeted her scars was about to be replaced by recognition that those marks represented not damage, but preparation for exactly the kind of situation where lives depended on capabilities that existed outside normal institutional hierarchies and professional credentialing systems. Sergeant Park's years of special operations experience had taught him to recognize expertise regardless of where it appeared, and Sarah's analysis of Brooks's tactical approach contained details that no civilian should have understood without extensive military training in urban warfare and counter-terrorism operations. Her assessment of the explosive device's likely composition and triggering mechanisms demonstrated knowledge of demolitions that went beyond basic ordnance handling, while her understanding of Brooks's psychological profile suggested experience with adversaries whose capabilities exceeded normal criminal behavior. When she began explaining how the building's structural characteristics could be exploited to create tactical advantages that Brooks might not have anticipated, Park realized he was listening to someone whose expertise might provide solutions that conventional approaches couldn't access. The conversation that followed revealed technical knowledge that couldn't be faked or learned through casual observation, as Sarah demonstrated understanding of concepts that were taught only in specialized military programs and applied only in combat environments where mistakes resulted in casualties rather than embarrassment. Her explanation of how Brooks's positioning could be countered using techniques that exploited his assumptions about police capabilities contained tactical insights that impressed Park despite his extensive experience with special operations personnel. When she described potential approach routes through the building's mechanical systems that wouldn't appear on standard blueprints, her knowledge of infrastructure details combined with military tactics in ways that suggested someone who had received training that far exceeded anything civilian security work would require. Park's decision to probe deeper into Sarah's background represented both professional curiosity and growing recognition that the woman whose insights were impressing him might possess qualifications that could transform their tactical options. His questions about her assessment of Brooks's likely timeline and objectives revealed understanding of military psychology that civilian law enforcement personnel typically lacked, while her analysis of potential countermeasures demonstrated familiarity with tactics that were classified beyond most security clearances. when she unconsciously began using military terminology that accurately described concepts civilian language couldn't convey. Park's suspicions about her background crystallized into certainty that he was dealing with someone whose expertise significantly exceeded what her current position suggested. The moment of revelation came when Sarah's sleeve shifted during their conversation, exposing distinctive tattoo work that Park recognized immediately as marking someone who had earned credentials that placed them among the military's most elite performers. The eagle and crosshairs that identified 82nd Airborne snipers were accompanied by unit designations that Park knew represented deployment with Special Operations Forces in combat zones, where survival required capabilities that exceeded normal military training. His reaction was immediate and transformative as he realized that the scarred security guard whose insights had been impressing him possessed qualifications that exceeded those of anyone else involved in the current crisis. Response: Sarah's decision to reveal her background represented calculated risk that years of civilian anonymity had taught her to avoid. But the desperate situation demanded that personal protection be set aside for sake of innocent lives that conventional approaches seemed increasingly unlikely to save. Her explanation of her military service was delivered with matter-of-fact precision that combat veterans used when discussing experiences that civilian populations couldn't comprehend, detailing 3 combat deployments that had resulted in 47 confirmed kills and expertise in urban warfare that had been gained through operations that remained classified years after their completion. The medical discharge that had ended her military career was described without self-pity or drama, simply as a career-ending injury that had forced adaptation to civilian life, where her capabilities were neither needed nor appreciated. Park's verification of Sarah's credentials through military databases confirmed what he had already suspected from her technical knowledge and tactical insights, revealing service records that placed her among the most decorated snipers in recent military history. Her combat experience included operations in Afghanistan and Iraq, where she had served with special forces units, conducting missions that required precision shooting under conditions that challenged the limits of human capability and equipment. Performance: the commendations in her file described someone whose skills had saved countless lives through tactical interventions that eliminated threats while minimizing collateral damage. Exactly the kind of expertise that the current situation required but that civilian law enforcement couldn't provide. The transformation in how Park viewed Sarah extended beyond simple recognition of military credentials to encompass understanding that her positioning inside the building, combined with her intimate knowledge of its layout and systems, provided tactical advantages that no external assault team could duplicate. Her ability to move through the community center undetected by Brooks, who was monitoring all conventional approach routes, offered opportunities for intervention that wouldn't exist once his attention was drawn to potential threats. More importantly, her sniper training provided capabilities for precision engagement that could neutralize Brooks without triggering explosive devices that would kill hostages in any conventional assault scenario. Captain Thompson's initial reaction to Park's report about Sarah's qualifications reflected institutional skepticism about credentials that seemed too convenient to be genuine, but the verification through official channels confirmed that they had been overlooking someone whose expertise exceeded that of any available tactical resource. The irony wasn't lost on Thompson that department protocols had been dismissing input from someone whose qualifications surpassed those of federal agents who might eventually be called to assist with crisis resolution. Sarah's analysis of Brooks's capabilities and tactical positioning suddenly took on entirely different significance when evaluated as professional assessment rather than civilian speculation. The tactical planning session that followed, Sarah's revelation transformed from desperate brainstorming about limited options to strategic coordination of capabilities that could potentially resolve the crisis without catastrophic casualties. Her knowledge of the building's mechanical systems provided access routes that Brooks hadn't anticipated when planning his defensive measures, while her understanding of his psychological profile suggested approaches that could exploit his assumptions about police capabilities and limitations. Most importantly, her sniper training offered precision engagement options that could eliminate the threat without triggering explosive devices that made conventional assault scenarios unacceptably dangerous. Sarah's proposal for resolving the hostage situation was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its implications for Brooks's carefully planned operation. Using her access to building systems and knowledge of structural characteristics that wouldn't appear on standard blueprints, she could position herself for precision engagement that would neutralize Brooks before he could implement whatever final phase his timeline was designed to achieve. The approach required accepting risks that violated every safety protocol in law enforcement manuals, but the alternatives were either compliance with impossible demands or assault, scenarios that would likely result in mass casualties among innocent hostages. The preparation phase revealed how thoroughly Sarah's military expertise had been adapted to civilian environments as she transformed from overlooked security guard to tactical asset with efficiency that impressed experienced law enforcement professionals. Her knowledge of the community center's infrastructure allowed her to identify approach routes that would remain undetected by Brooks's surveillance systems, while her understanding of his psychological profile suggested timing and positioning that could maximize the element of surprise. The confidence with which she planned and executed tactical movements demonstrated why she had earned legendary status among military snipers, whose capabilities were measured by their ability to accomplish impossible missions under conditions that would overwhelm lesser performers. The technical aspects of Sarah's approach required coordination between her precision capabilities and law enforcement resources in ways that challenged every protocol for civilian-military cooperation. During crisis situations, her ability to communicate Brooks's exact position and status to assault teams through building systems that he couldn't monitor provided intelligence that transformed conventional tactical disadvantages into overwhelming advantages for forces that had been struggling with limited information and restricted access. The synchronization required between her engagement timeline and emergency medical response represented coordination challenges that tested everyone's ability to adapt established procedures to circumstances that exceeded normal training scenarios. The moment of engagement revealed why Sarah had earned recognition as one of the military's most capable snipers, as she eliminated Brooks with precision that neutralized the threat while avoiding any possibility of triggering explosive devices that could have killed dozens of hostages. The shot placement and timing demonstrated tactical expertise that had been honed through combat experience, where mistakes resulted in friendly casualties rather than mission failure, while her immediate transition to explosive device assessment showed understanding of demolitions that allowed safe evacuation of hostages who had been trapped by Brooks's sophisticated defensive measures. The aftermath of Sarah's intervention transformed not just the immediate crisis, but fundamental assumptions about how expertise was recognized and utilized within law enforcement and military communities. The families who had been facing potential death discovered that their survival had depended on capabilities possessed by someone they had never noticed, whose scars marked experiences that had prepared her for exactly the kind of situation where conventional approaches proved inadequate. The children whose science fair had become a nightmare would remember how their safety had been restored by someone whose appearance suggested vulnerability, but whose actions demonstrated strength that exceeded anything they had previously encountered. Captain Thompson's assessment of the operation acknowledged that Sarah's unique combination of building knowledge, tactical positioning, and combat expertise had provided solutions that no conventional resource could have duplicated. The precision required to neutralize Brooks without triggering explosive devices exceeded capabilities available through normal law enforcement channels, while her understanding of his psychological profile had enabled tactical approaches that exploited weaknesses in preparation that had otherwise appeared comprehensive. The success of her intervention validated tactical thinking that challenged institutional assumptions about how expertise should be recognized and utilized during crisis situations. The institutional changes that followed Sarah's demonstration extended far beyond Phoenix Police Department procedures to encompass broader recognition that relevant capabilities might be found in unexpected places and overlooked populations. Her story became required study material for crisis response training programs that emphasized the importance of identifying and utilizing all available expertise, regardless of how it was packaged or where it was found. Military liaison programs were established to ensure that veteran expertise residing in civilian communities could be accessed during emergencies that exceeded normal law enforcement capabilities. Dr. Chun's psychological analysis of the hostage situations resolution focused on broader implications for how society recognized and valued individuals whose experiences had prepared them for challenges that civilian populations couldn't anticipate. Sarah's transformation from dismissed security guard to tactical hero demonstrated how assumptions based on appearance and position could prevent recognition of capabilities that might prove essential during crisis situations. The trauma counseling provided to families emphasized how their survival had depended on someone whose hidden expertise had been available throughout their ordeal, but unrecognized until circumstances forced its revelation. The legal proceedings that followed Brooks's death revealed the extent of his preparation and the sophistication of threats that contemporary society might face from individuals whose military training had been combined with personal grievances and tactical planning that exceeded normal criminal behavior. Sarah's testimony about his capabilities and likely intentions provided insights that influenced policy discussions about identifying and monitoring veterans whose psychological profiles suggested potential for violence that could exceed normal domestic dispute parameters. The explosive devices he had constructed were analyzed by federal agencies whose assessments confirmed that his technical capabilities had posed threats that conventional law enforcement wouldn't have been equipped to counter. The recognition that Sarah received for her role in resolving the crisis was both overwhelming and somewhat uncomfortable for someone who had grown accustomed to anonymity and whose civilian identity had been carefully constructed to avoid attention that military service had taught her to regard with suspicion. The media coverage focused on dramatic elements of her transformation from overlooked security guard to tactical hero, but missed deeper implications about how society's assumptions prevented recognition of expertise that might be essential during situations that challenged conventional capabilities and institutional resources. The employment opportunities that resulted from her newfound recognition included positions with federal agencies whose missions required exactly the kind of expertise she possessed. But Sarah's response surprised officials who assumed that career advancement would be her primary motivation. Her decision to remain with the community center while establishing consulting relationships with law enforcement agencies reflected priorities that emphasized service over recognition and community connection over institutional advancement. The consulting work allowed her to contribute expertise where it was needed, while maintaining the quiet civilian life that had provided healing after military service ended. The training programs that Sarah developed for law enforcement agencies emphasized tactical concepts that conventional police work rarely encountered, but that contemporary threats increasingly required. Her curriculum included threat assessment techniques that recognized military training in civilian populations, crisis response coordination that utilized all available expertise regardless of institutional boundaries, and precision engagement, scenarios that required capabilities beyond normal police training. The programs became models for other jurisdictions whose recognition of changing threat environments demanded adaptation of traditional approaches to crisis management and tactical response. the community center where Sarah had found refuge from. The complexities of military service became a symbol of how hidden expertise could emerge during crisis situations to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. The families whose lives had been saved by her intervention established scholarship programs for children whose interests in science and technology reflected the curiosity and innovation that had been celebrating when Brooks's attack transformed their gathering into a life-threatening situation. The memorial established in the building honored not just Sarah's service, but broader recognition of veterans whose contributions to community safety might remain invisible until circumstances demanded their expertise. The psychological impact of the crisis on children who had experienced the transition from celebration to terror to salvation provided insights that influenced educational approaches to preparing young people for contemporary security realities, without destroying their optimism and curiosity about the world. Sarah's involvement in counseling programs drew on her understanding of how trauma affected individuals differently and how recovery required recognition that survival often depended on factors beyond personal control or institutional protection. The resilience demonstrated by families who had faced potential death became testament to human adaptability and community strength that transcended individual capabilities. The long-term changes in how Phoenix handled community events reflected lessons learned about threat assessment and resource allocation that had broader implications for public safety in environments where traditional security measures might prove inadequate against adversaries whose capabilities exceeded normal criminal behavior. Sarah's recommendations for facility security emphasized approaches that balanced protection with accessibility, ensuring that community gatherings could continue without becoming fortified zones that destroyed the social connections they were designed to promote. The protocols developed from her expertise became models for other jurisdictions whose recognition of evolving threats required adaptation of conventional security thinking. The personal relationships that Sarah developed with families whose lives she had saved represented connections that transcended the dramatic circumstances of their first meeting to encompass ongoing friendships based on shared experiences and mutual respect that had been forged under extreme conditions. The children who had been hostages grew up with understanding that their safety had depended on someone whose appearance suggested vulnerability, but whose actions demonstrated strength that challenged every assumption about how capability and expertise should be recognized. Their relationships with Sarah provided ongoing education about resilience, service, and the importance of looking beyond surface appearances to recognize the deeper qualities that define human worth. The professional recognition that Sarah eventually received from military and law enforcement communities acknowledged not just her tactical intervention during the hostage crisis, but broader contributions to understanding how veteran expertise could be integrated into civilian security frameworks. Her consulting work influenced policy discussions about identifying and utilizing military experience that resided in civilian communities, while her training programs demonstrated how tactical knowledge could be adapted to law enforcement needs without compromising either effectiveness or civilian oversight. The respect she earned from colleagues who had initially dismissed her reflected broader cultural shifts in how expertise was recognized and valued. The weeks following the community center crisis brought unprecedented attention to Sarah Mitchell's story, but the media coverage struggled to capture the complexity of someone whose life had been defined by service, sacrifice, and the quiet determination to protect others regardless of personal cost. Television interviews and newspaper profiles focused on dramatic elements of her transformation from overlooked security guard to tactical hero, but they missed the deeper narrative about how society's assumptions prevented recognition of expertise that might prove essential during situations that challenged conventional capabilities. Sarah's reluctance to embrace celebrity status reflected values shaped by military service where individual recognition was less important than mission success and team survival. The psychological adjustment required to transition from anonymity to public recognition proved more challenging than the tactical demands of the hostage crisis itself, as Sarah found herself navigating media attention and institutional interest that felt foreign after years of deliberate invisibility. The scars that had once prompted averted gazes now drew curious stares from people who wanted to understand how someone bearing such obvious marks of trauma had developed capabilities that exceeded those of trained law enforcement professionals. Her careful responses to interview questions revealed someone uncomfortable with attention, while simultaneously recognizing that her story might influence how society viewed veterans whose contributions remained unrecognized or undervalued. The federal agencies that approached Sarah with employment opportunities represented recognition of capabilities that exceeded local law enforcement needs, but their offers revealed institutional thinking that focused on utilizing her expertise, rather than understanding the personal journey that had shaped her approach to service and protection. The FBI's Counterterrorism Division saw someone whose tactical knowledge could enhance their response to domestic threats, while the Department of Homeland Security viewed her experience as valuable for training programs designed to prepare civilian law enforcement for adversaries whose military backgrounds created challenges that exceeded normal police capabilities. Sarah's careful consideration of these opportunities reflected priorities that emphasized meaningful contribution over career advancement. The consulting relationship that Sarah eventually established with multiple agencies allowed her to contribute expertise while maintaining the community connections that had provided healing after military service ended, creating a hybrid role that served institutional needs without sacrificing personal values that prioritized service over recognition. Her work with Phoenix Police Department evolved from crisis response consultation to comprehensive program development that influenced how the department identified and utilized veteran expertise residing in civilian communities. The training curricula she developed emphasized threat assessment techniques that recognized military training in civilian populations, while addressing tactical scenarios that required capabilities beyond normal police preparation. The community center where Sarah had found refuge became a focal point for discussions about how public spaces could balance accessibility with security in environments where traditional protection measures might prove inadequate against sophisticated threats. Her recommendations for facility modifications emphasized approaches that enhanced safety without creating fortress-like environments that would destroy the social connections these spaces were designed to promote. The memorial garden established in honor of families who had faced potential tragedy during the science fair became a symbol of community resilience and the importance of recognizing hidden strengths that existed within seemingly vulnerable populations. The children who had been hostages during Brooks's attack grew up with unique perspectives on resilience, protection, and the importance of looking beyond surface appearances to recognize deeper qualities that defined human worth and capability. Their relationships with Sarah provided ongoing education about service, sacrifice, and the complex realities that shaped adult lives in ways that childhood innocence couldn't fully comprehend, but could begin to appreciate. The science fair that had nearly ended in tragedy was resumed the following year with enhanced security measures that reflected lessons learned about balancing protection with the openness that made community gatherings meaningful. The legal ramifications of Brooks's attack extended beyond criminal proceedings to encompass broader policy discussions about identifying and monitoring veterans whose psychological profiles suggested potential for violence that exceeded normal domestic dispute parameters. Sarah's testimony before congressional committees examining veteran mental health services provided insights that influenced funding decisions and program development designed to provide support for former military personnel struggling with civilian adjustment challenges. Her advocacy emphasized the importance of recognizing that most veterans successfully transitioned to civilian life while ensuring that those facing difficulties received appropriate intervention before their problems escalated. into threats against innocent civilians. The psychological counseling programs that Sarah helped develop for crisis survivors drew on her understanding of how trauma affected individuals differently, and how recovery required recognition that survival often depended on factors beyond personal control or conventional protection measures. Her work with families who had experienced the hostage situation emphasized resilience-building techniques that acknowledged vulnerability, while building confidence in community support systems and individual capability to overcome adversity. The therapeutic approaches she advocated balanced realistic threat assessment with optimism about human adaptability and social connections that transcended individual limitations. The academic research that emerged from analysis of the community center crisis influenced educational approaches in multiple disciplines, from criminal justice programs that studied unconventional tactical solutions to psychology courses that examined how expertise was recognized and utilized during emergency situations. Sarah's collaboration with university researchers provided case study material that challenged traditional assumptions about professional credentials and institutional hierarchies, while demonstrating how life experience could create capabilities that exceeded formal training in specific circumstances. The scholarly papers that resulted from these collaborations became required reading in courses examining leadership, crisis management, and social psychology. The veteran support organizations that sought Sarah's involvement recognized that her story represented broader themes about military to civilian transition challenges and opportunities that existed for utilizing veteran expertise in ways that benefited both former service members and civilian communities. Her participation in mentorship programs connected recently discharged veterans with civilian employment opportunities that utilized their military training while providing meaningful contribution to community safety and security. The networking events she helped organize created connections between veterans and civilian employers who were learning to recognize capabilities that military service had developed, but that traditional job interviews rarely identified. The law enforcement agencies that implemented training programs based on Sarah's expertise reported significant improvements in their ability to handle complex tactical situations that required capabilities beyond standard police preparation, while also developing better relationships with veteran communities whose members had previously felt disconnected from civilian protection services. Her curriculum emphasized communication techniques that recognized military cultural values, while addressing tactical scenarios that required coordination between civilian law enforcement and individuals whose combat experience provided capabilities that could enhance rather than complicate official responses to crisis situations. The security consulting firm that Sarah established several years after the community center incident specialized in threat assessment and response planning for institutions that served vulnerable populations in environments where traditional protection measures might prove inadequate against sophisticated adversaries. Her client base included schools, hospitals, and community centers whose missions required balancing accessibility with security in ways that preserve their fundamental purposes, while providing protection against threats that exceeded normal criminal behavior. The holistic approach she developed emphasized community engagement and staff training alongside physical security measures that enhanced protection without creating institutional environments that felt oppressive or unwelcoming. The international recognition that Sarah's work eventually received reflected growing global awareness that contemporary security challenges required solutions that transcended traditional boundaries between military and civilian expertise, while acknowledging that relevant capabilities might be found in unexpected places and overlooked populations. Her presentations at conferences examining homeland security and counterterrorism strategies influenced policy discussions in multiple countries whose recognition of evolving threat environments demanded adaptation of conventional approaches to crisis management and tactical response. The protocols she developed became models for institutions worldwide whose missions required protecting civilian populations from adversaries whose capabilities exceeded normal criminal behavior. The personal relationships that sustained Sarah throughout her transition from military service to civilian recognition represented connections that transcended professional accomplishments to encompass genuine friendships based on shared values and mutual respect that had been tested under extreme conditions. The families whose lives she had saved remained close friends whose children grew up viewing her as an extended family member whose presence provided security and wisdom that enriched their understanding of courage, service, and community responsibility. These relationships provided Sarah with the emotional foundation that enabled her professional contributions while maintaining the personal connections that made civilian life meaningful. The mentorship role that Sarah embraced with young veterans struggling with civilian adjustment challenges drew on her understanding of how military experience created capabilities that could be channeled into meaningful civilian contribution. While addressing the psychological needs that shaped successful transition from military to civilian identity, her guidance emphasized the importance of finding purpose that utilized military training while building connections within civilian communities that valued service and expertise, regardless of how it was packaged or where it was found. A success. Stories that emerged from her mentorship reflected broader possibilities for veteran integration that benefited both former service members and civilian society. The legacy that Sarah's story created extended far beyond the dramatic circumstances of the community center crisis to encompass fundamental changes in how expertise was recognized, valued, and utilized within institutions whose missions required protecting civilian populations from threats that exceeded conventional criminal behavior. Her demonstration that relevant capabilities might be found in unexpected places influenced hiring practices, training programs, and crisis response protocols that emphasized comprehensive resource assessment over traditional credentialing systems. The cultural shift toward recognizing hidden expertise represented progress toward more inclusive and effective approaches to community safety and security. The educational initiatives that Sarah supported emphasized the importance of teaching young people to recognize capability and expertise regardless of how it was presented, while encouraging them to develop their own abilities in service of community needs that transcended individual advancement or recognition. Her involvement in STEM education programs drew connections between scientific curiosity and tactical problem solving that demonstrated how knowledge and creativity could be applied to challenges that required innovative solutions rather than conventional approaches. The scholarship programs established in her honor supported students whose interests in science and technology reflected the innovation and dedication that contemporary security challenges required. The community center that had been the site of potential tragedy became a symbol of how hidden strengths could emerge during crisis situations to protect those who couldn't protect themselves, while demonstrating that safety and security depended on community members whose contributions might remain invisible until circumstances demanded their expertise. The annual ceremony commemorating the families who had survived Brooks's attack celebrated not just Sarah's intervention, but broader recognition of community resilience and the importance of valuing all members whose experiences and capabilities contributed to collective well-being and protection. The transformation that Sarah's story represented challenged fundamental assumptions about how society recognized and valued individuals whose experiences had prepared them for challenges that civilian populations couldn't anticipate or address through conventional means. Her journey from dismissed security guard to recognized expert demonstrated that expertise existed in many forms and places, requiring only recognition and opportunity to contribute to solutions that conventional approaches couldn't provide. The laughter that had once greeted her scars was replaced by respect for someone whose visible wounds represented invisible capabilities that had saved lives and influenced institutions, whose missions required protecting others from threats that exceeded normal preparation. The ongoing impact of Sarah's work continued to influence discussions about veteran integration, community security, and the importance of recognizing capabilities that existed outside traditional institutional boundaries, while demonstrating that meaningful contribution to civilian society often required innovative approaches to utilizing expertise that military service had developed. Her story became testament to the possibility that individual experiences of trauma and recovery could be transformed into community resources that enhanced safety and security for populations whose protection depended on capabilities that exceeded conventional preparation and institutional response. 5 years after the community center crisis, Sarah Mitchell stood before the graduating class of the Phoenix Police Academy's newly established Tactical Integration Program, watching young officers whose training now included recognition protocols that could have prevented the oversight that had nearly cost dozens of lives during that terrifying morning when assumptions about expertise almost proved fatal. The curriculum she had developed emphasized not just tactical response techniques, but fundamental shifts in how law enforcement personnel assessed available resources during crisis situations, teaching them to look beyond conventional credentials, to identify capabilities that might prove essential when standard approaches reached their limitations. The Police Academy's transformation reflected broader changes in law enforcement culture that extended far beyond Phoenix to encompass departments nationwide whose recognition of evolving threat environments had demanded adaptation of traditional approaches to crisis management and resource utilization. Sarah's influence on these institutional changes operated through multiple channels, from direct consulting relationships with major metropolitan departments to policy recommendations that shaped federal guidelines for local law enforcement agencies, whose missions required protecting civilian populations from adversaries whose capabilities exceeded normal criminal behavior patterns. The research institute that had been established at Arizona State University to study unconventional crisis response methodologies bore Sarah's name but reflected her values in its emphasis on practical application over academic recognition, focusing on developing solutions that could be implemented by real-world institutions facing actual threats rather than theoretical scenarios that existed only in classroom discussions. The interdisciplinary approach that characterized the Institute's work brought together experts from fields ranging from military science to social psychology, creating collaborative environments where diverse perspectives could contribute to understanding complex challenges that single-discipline approaches couldn't adequately address. The international delegations that regularly visited Phoenix to study the city's innovative approaches to community security and veteran integration represented recognition that Sarah's work had implications extending far beyond American law enforcement to encompass global challenges faced by societies attempting to balance accessibility with protection in environments where traditional security measures might prove inadequate against sophisticated threats. Her presentations to these visiting delegations emphasized principles rather than specific tactics, focusing on adaptable concepts that could be modified to fit different cultural contexts and institutional structures while maintaining effectiveness against adversaries whose capabilities transcended normal criminal behavior. The nonprofit organization that Sarah had founded to support veteran transition initiatives operated on principles that reflected her understanding of how military experience created capabilities that could be channeled into meaningful civilian contribution while addressing psychological needs that shape successful adaptation to post-service life. The program she developed emphasized community integration over institutional placement, recognizing that sustainable veteran success required building connections within civilian populations rather than creating separate support systems that inadvertently reinforced separation between military and civilian identities. The corporate training programs that had emerged from Sarah's consulting work addressed business community recognition that contemporary security challenges required, employee awareness and response capabilities that exceeded traditional workplace safety protocols, while acknowledging that relevant expertise might exist within their workforce in forms that CONVENTIONAL human resources practices rarely identified or utilized. Her curriculum for civilian employees emphasized situational awareness and community responsibility alongside personal protection, creating workplace cultures that enhanced security through collective vigilance rather than individual isolation or institutional dependence on external protection services. The scholarship fund that bore Sarah's name supported students whose academic interests in science, technology, and public service reflected the innovation and dedication that contemporary security challenges required, while emphasizing educational approaches that prepared young people to contribute to community well-being through diverse career paths that utilize their unique capabilities and interests. The recipients of these scholarships represented the next generation of leaders who would face threats and challenges that current institutions could barely imagine, requiring creative solutions and collaborative approaches that transcended traditional professional boundaries. The memoir that Sarah had reluctantly agreed to write became a best-selling account that reached audiences far beyond military and law enforcement communities to encompass general readers whose understanding of service, sacrifice, and resilience was enriched by her honest portrayal of the complexities that shaped veteran experiences in civilian society. The book's impact extended beyond entertainment or inspiration to influence policy discussions about veteran healthcare, employment assistance, and community integration that address systemic challenges rather than individual symptoms of institutional failure to recognize and utilize military experience effectively. The documentary film that chronicled the community center crisis and its aftermath brought Sarah's story to international audiences whose exposure to her experiences influenced broader cultural conversations about recognizing expertise, overcoming prejudicial assumptions, and creating inclusive communities that valued contribution over appearance or conventional credentials. The film's success led to speaking engagements at universities, conferences, and community events where Sarah's message about hidden capabilities and unrecognized expertise resonated with diverse audiences facing their own challenges related to social inclusion and opportunity recognition. The mentorship network that had grown from Sarah's individual efforts to support transitioning veterans had evolved into a national organization that connected former military personnel with civilian opportunities that utilized their expertise while providing meaningful contribution to community safety, security, and resilience. The success stories that emerged from this network demonstrated possibilities for veteran integration that benefited both former service members and civilian society, creating positive examples that challenged stereotypes about military to civilian transition while showcasing capabilities that military experience had developed. The technology platform that Sarah had helped develop for crisis communication and resource coordination addressed lessons learned from the community center incident about information sharing and tactical coordination between diverse agencies and individuals whose capabilities might prove essential during emergency situations. The system's design emphasized flexibility and inclusivity over rigid hierarchical structures, allowing expertise to be recognized and utilized regardless of its institutional affiliation or conventional credentialing, while maintaining security protocols that protected sensitive information and operational planning. The annual conference that brought together law enforcement, military, academic, and community representatives to discuss innovative approaches to public safety and security had become the premier forum for sharing research, developing policy recommendations, and building collaborative relationships that transcended traditional institutional boundaries. Sarah's keynote addresses at these gatherings emphasized themes of service, recognition, and community responsibility that influenced attendees, whose work shaped public policy and institutional practices affecting millions of citizens whose safety depended on effective coordination between diverse protection services and community resources. The legislative testimony that Sarah provided to congressional committees examining veteran affairs, homeland security, and community policing issues influenced policy development at federal levels while highlighting local innovations that could be scaled up or adapted to address national challenges. Her advocacy emphasized evidence-based approaches over political rhetoric, focusing on proven solutions and measurable outcomes that demonstrated how innovative thinking and inclusive resource utilization could enhance public safety while strengthening community connections and social cohesion. The medical research that had emerged from studies of Sarah's injury recovery and subsequent capability development provided insights that influenced treatment approaches for other veterans whose combat injuries had created both physical limitations and psychological challenges that traditional rehabilitation programs struggled to address effectively. Her participation in these research initiatives reflected commitment to contributing knowledge that could benefit others facing similar circumstances, while demonstrating that recovery from trauma could involve developing new capabilities, rather than simply returning to pre-injury status. The art therapy programs that Sarah supported for trauma survivors drew on her understanding of how creative expression could provide healing pathways that traditional counseling approaches might not access, while creating opportunities for individuals to contribute beauty and meaning to communities that had supported their recovery. The exhibitions that showcased work created by these programs demonstrated resilience and creativity that challenged assumptions about disability and limitation while celebrating human capability to transform difficult experiences into positive contribution to social and cultural enrichment. The community garden that had been established at the site where the memorial honored families who had survived the hostage crisis became a symbol of growth, renewal, and the possibility that traumatic experiences could be transformed into sources of strength and community connection. Sarah's involvement in maintaining this space reflected her understanding that healing required not just individual recovery but collective acknowledgement of shared experiences and mutual support that strengthened community bonds, while honoring those whose courage and sacrifice had protected others. The international recognition that Sarah's work eventually received included awards and honors that acknowledged her contributions to public safety, veteran affairs, and community development, but she remained most proud of the relationships she had built with individuals whose lives had been touched by her service and whose success demonstrated possibilities for personal transformation and community contribution that transcended conventional expectations and institutional limitations. The educational partnerships that Sarah had developed with schools throughout the Phoenix area brought military expertise into civilian classrooms in ways that enrich student understanding of service, sacrifice, and civic responsibility, while providing practical knowledge about conflict resolution, emergency preparedness, and community cooperation. Her presentations to students emphasized themes of resilience, adaptability, and the importance of recognizing that everyone possessed capabilities that could contribute to collective well-being if given appropriate recognition and opportunity for expression. The consulting work that continued to occupy much of Sarah's professional time had evolved from crisis response training to comprehensive organizational development that helped institutions create cultures capable of recognizing and utilizing all available expertise while maintaining effectiveness and accountability. Her client base included corporations, government agencies, and nonprofit organizations whose missions required balancing diverse stakeholder needs while achieving objectives that demanded innovative solutions and collaborative approaches that transcended traditional hierarchical structures. The personal relationships that sustained Sarah, throughout her journey from military service through civilian recognition, represented connections that had been tested under extreme conditions, while growing stronger through shared experiences of challenge, growth, and mutual support. The families whose lives she had saved remained close friends whose children had grown up viewing her as an extended family member whose presence provided security and wisdom that enriched their understanding of courage, service, and community responsibility. The retirement plans that Sarah was beginning to consider emphasized continued service and community contribution over personal relaxation or individual fulfillment, reflecting values shaped by military experience and reinforced through civilian work that had demonstrated the satisfaction that came from protecting others and contributing to collective well-being. Her vision for the next phase of life included expanded mentorship activities, continued research into veteran integration challenges, and deeper involvement in educational initiatives that prepared young people for leadership roles in increasingly complex social and security environments. The philosophical reflections that characterized Sarah's approach to life and work emphasized themes of service, humility, and recognition that individual capability was meaningful only when channeled toward purposes that transcended personal advancement or recognition. Her understanding of expertise as responsibility rather than privilege shaped her interactions with others, while influencing institutional approaches to talent recognition and resource utilization that enhanced organizational effectiveness while creating more inclusive and supportive community environments. The legacy that Sarah's story represented extended far beyond the dramatic circumstances of the community center crisis to encompass fundamental changes in how society recognized, valued, and utilized expertise that existed outside traditional institutional boundaries and conventional credentialing systems. Her demonstration that relevant capabilities might be found in unexpected places had influenced hiring practices, training programs, and crisis response protocols while creating cultural shifts toward more inclusive and effective approaches to community safety and security. The inspiration that countless individuals had drawn from Sarah's example of transformation from dismissed security guard to recognized expert demonstrated possibilities for personal growth and social contribution that transcended apparent limitations, while encouraging others to recognize their own capabilities and seek opportunities to contribute meaningfully to community well-being. Her story had become testament to human resilience and the importance of maintaining hope and determination even when circumstances seemed to offer limited opportunities for positive change or meaningful contribution. The enduring impact of Sarah's work continued to influence discussions about veteran integration, community security, expert recognition, and social inclusion while demonstrating that individual experiences of trauma and recovery could be transformed into community resources that enhanced safety and security for populations whose protection depended on capabilities that exceeded conventional preparation and institutional response. The scars that had once prompted dismissive laughter had become symbols of experience and expertise that commanded respect while inspiring others to look beyond surface appearances to recognize deeper qualities that defined human worth and potential for positive contribution to collective well-being and community resilience. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.